It was a chilly Monday morning when Jaden, a bright and confident 12-year-old, walked into class with his usual enthusiasm. His mother always told him, no matter what the world throws at you, hold your head high. That's exactly how Jaden lived his life, boldly, with a smile that could light up the room. But today was different. There was a tension in the air that no one could quite explain. Mr. Dawson, the new substitute teacher, stood at the front of the room with an intimidating presence. He was known for being strict, often crossing the line between discipline and unfairness. As students settled in, whispering nervously among themselves, Jaden took his seat near the window, gazing out at the playground, imagining the games he'd play later during recess. "Quiet down," Mr. Dawson barked, slamming a ruler onto his desk. The class fell silent, the cheerful chatter replaced by uneasy glances. Jaden, however, continued to scribble in his notebook, lost in his own world. "You there, stand up." Mr. Dawson's voice cut through the quiet like a whip. Jaden looked up, startled. "Yes, you. Did you not hear me?" The teacher snarled. Jaden stood, clutching his notebook, unsure of what he'd done wrong. "I asked a question, and you weren't paying attention," Mr. Dawson accused. "Do you think you're too good to listen in my class?" Jaden shook his head. "No, sir. I was just." "Just what?" "Making excuses." Mr. Dawson interrupted, his voice growing louder. The other students watched in stunned silence, afraid to intervene. Jaden's calm demeanor didn't waver. "I didn't mean any disrespect, sir. I was just writing something down." But Mr. Dawson wasn't interested in explanations. He stepped closer, towering over the young boy. Without warning, he raised his hand and slapped Jaden across the cheek. The room gasped collectively, the sound of the slap echoing like a thunderclap. Jaden stumbled back, clutching his face, his eyes wide with shock and hurt. But instead of crying, he did something unexpected. He looked Mr. Dawson straight in the eyes and said firmly, "You'll regret that. My dad is your boss." The color drained from Mr. Dawson's face. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. A wave of panic washed over him as he realized the weight of Jaden's words. The classroom buzzed with whispers, students exchanging wide-eyed glances. Who was Jaden's dad? Could he really be Mr. Dawson's boss? But Jaden said no more. He simply returned to his seat, leaving the substitute teacher frozen in place, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Little did Mr. Dawson know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would turn his world upside down. The room remained eerily quiet after Jaden's words hung in the air. Mr. Dawson stood motionless, his face a strange mixture of confusion and fear. He seemed to be replaying the moment over and over in his head, trying to figure out if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jaden, on the other hand, sat down calmly, his composure unshaken despite the fiery red mark on his cheek. The rest of the class sat in stunned silence, too scared to speak or even move. Emily, Jaden's best friend, sat at the desk beside him, her hands clenched into fists under the table. She knew Jaden well enough to understand that he wasn't bluffing. But she also knew he wouldn't say more unless absolutely necessary. That's just who Jaden was, calm, confident, and always in control, even when things went sideways. Mr. Dawson cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "Open your textbooks to chapter 3, he muttered, his voice unsteady. But no one moved. All eyes were on him, watching his every twitch, every nervous glance. Jaden finally broke the tension, leaning back in his chair and opening his book with a loud thud. Slowly, the other students followed his lead, their movements awkward and hesitant. Mr. Dawson fumbled with his own book, flipping through pages he wasn't even reading. The rest of the lesson dragged on painfully. Mr. Dawson avoided looking in Jaden's direction, but it was obvious he was rattled. He stumbled over his words, lost his place in the textbook several times, and even snapped at another student for a minor mistake. The class could feel his panic, and it was clear he wanted nothing more than for the bell to ring and the day to end. When the bell finally did ring, the students filed out of the classroom quickly, whispering among themselves. Emily lingered behind, waiting for Jaden. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her eyes full of concern. Jaden shrugged, his calm demeanor unbroken. I'm fine. That was intense, Emily said, glancing toward the front of the room where Mr. Dawson was pretending to sort papers, clearly avoiding them. Yeah, Jaden replied, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. But it's not over yet. As they walked down the hallway, Emily couldn't help but press for more details. Jaden, what did you mean when you said your dad is his boss? Is that true? Jaden stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. I wasn't lying, Emily. My dad owns the company that hired him. Emily's jaw dropped. Wait, your dad owns the school district. Jaden nodded. Technically, yes. He's a major investor and sits on the board. Mr. Dawson probably doesn't even know who my dad is, but he's going to find out soon enough. Emily stared at him, both impressed and a little worried. Jaden, are you going to tell your dad what happened? Of course, Jaden said simply. He needs to know. But I'm not looking to ruin anyone's life. I just want Mr. Dawson to learn that he can't treat people like that. Emily nodded, understanding his point. She knew Jaden wasn't the type to seek revenge, but she also knew he wasn't someone to be pushed around. That evening, Jaden sat at the dinner table with his parents. His father, Mr. Carter, was a tall, charismatic man who commanded respect wherever he went. He was always dressed sharply, his demeanor calm and calculated. Jaden had inherited his confidence and strong sense of justice from him. So, how was school today? Mr. Carter asked, slicing into his steak. Jaden hesitated for a moment before replying, Something happened that I think you should know about. Mr. Carter put down his fork, his full attention on his son. What's wrong? Jaden recounted the events of the day, sparing no details. He described how Mr. Dawson had unfairly singled him out, how the slap had left a mark on his cheek, and how he had responded with the now famous line about his dad being the teacher's boss. By the time he finished, his mother looked horrified, and his father's expression was unreadable. There was a long silence before Mr. Carter finally spoke. He hit you, he said quietly, his voice steady, but laced with anger. Jaden nodded. I'm okay, Dad. It's not about the slap. It's about the way he treated me, like I didn't matter. Like he could just walk all over me because I'm a kid. Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he thought. This Mr. Dawson, does he know who I am? Jaden shrugged. I don't think so. But he knows now that you're his boss. Mr. Carter's lips curled into a faint smile. Well, that's interesting. His mother, on the other hand, wasn't as calm. This is unacceptable, she exclaimed. That man shouldn't be allowed to teach children. He should be fired. Jaden placed a hand on her arm. Mom, I don't want to ruin his career. I just want him to understand that what he did was wrong. Mr. Carter nodded in agreement. Wise words, son. But there will still be consequences. I'll handle it. The next morning, Jaden walked into school with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't scared of Mr. Dawson or anyone else. If anything, he felt stronger, knowing his dad had his back. When he entered the classroom, he noticed Mr. Dawson sitting at his desk, looking even more disheveled than the day before. The teacher's eyes darted to Jaden, then quickly away, as if he couldn't bear to make eye contact. Jaden took his seat and began unpacking his bag, pretending not to notice the nervous energy radiating from the front of the room. Just before the bell rang, the principal, Mrs. Reynolds, appeared at the door. She was a stern but fair woman, known for her no-nonsense attitude. Mr. Dawson, she said curtly, a word, please. The substitute teacher's face went pale as he stood and followed her out of the room. The class erupted into whispers as soon as the door closed behind them. What do you think is going to happen? Emily whispered to Jaden. I don't know, Jaden replied, keeping his voice low. But I think this is just the beginning. Minutes felt like hours as the students whispered amongst themselves, speculating on what was happening outside the classroom. Jaden remained calm, focused on his notebook, though he couldn't entirely ignore the glances being cast his way. Emily leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they're firing him right now?" Jaden shook his head. "I doubt it. My dad doesn't work like that. He's all about teaching lessons, not destroying lives. If anything, Mr. Dawson is probably being warned this time." Outside the classroom, the conversation between Mr. Dawson and Principal Reynolds was anything but quiet. Though muffled, the sound of raised voices drifted through the closed door. The students exchanged wide-eyed looks every time they caught snippets of the heated exchange. "I didn't know." Mr. Dawson's panicked voice carried through faintly, though his words were hard to make out. "I wasn't informed." "That's no excuse, Mr. Dawson," Principal Reynolds interrupted sternly. "Your behavior yesterday was unacceptable, regardless of who the student's father is. We have zero tolerance for physical discipline in this school." Jaden couldn't help but wonder what was being said. Part of him felt a pang of guilt. Despite everything, he didn't want to see anyone lose their job. But he also knew that actions had consequences, and Mr. Dawson needed to face his. When the door finally opened, the room fell silent. Mr. Dawson walked back in, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. He avoided looking at Jaden entirely as he resumed his place at the desk. "Class, continue with your assignments," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But the usual flow of the day felt disrupted. The students weren't as chatty as they normally would be, and every move Mr. Dawson made seemed to be scrutinized. It was clear he was no longer in control of the room, and he knew it. As the day progressed, Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about what had happened in the classroom. There was more to the story, something deeper that he couldn't yet see. When lunch finally came around, he decided to dig a little further. Jaden and Emily found a quiet corner in the cafeteria, away from the prying ears of their classmates. "You think he's hiding something?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed. Jaden nodded. "Maybe." He looked more scared than angry today. "It's like he knows he's in trouble, but not just because of what he did to me." Emily thought for a moment, then glanced around before leaning closer. "My mom works in the district office," she whispered. "She told me there was something weird about how Mr. Dawson got hired. She said it was a last-minute thing, like someone pulled strings to get him the job." Jaden raised an eyebrow. "Pulled strings? Why would anyone do that for him?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Maybe your dad knows more about it." Later that evening, Jaden decided to bring it up with his father. He waited until after dinner, when they were sitting in the living room. His dad was reading through some documents, but he set them aside when he noticed Jaden standing there, looking thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Mr. Carter asked. Jaden hesitated, then said, "Emily told me something today. She said Mr. Dawson's hiring was unusual, like someone pulled strings to get him the job. Is that true?" Mr. Carter's expression darkened slightly, but he maintained his calm demeanor. "Where did Emily hear that?" "Her mom works in the district office," Jaden replied. Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. It's true that his hiring was unconventional. The district was in a bind. They needed someone quickly, and his resume was solid enough on paper. But there were some concerns that were brushed aside to fill the position. "What kind of concerns?" Jaden asked, his curiosity piqued. "Let's just say Mr. Dawson has a history," Mr. Carter said carefully. "Nothing criminal, but there were complaints at his previous schools, issues with his temper, his methods of discipline. Those complaints should have been investigated more thoroughly before he was hired here." Jaden frowned. "So why was he hired anyway?" Mr. Carter gave him a measured look. "Sometimes people make decisions for the sake of convenience, not necessarily for what's right. But those decisions have a way of catching up to them." Jaden thought about that for a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but it was clear that there was more to Mr. Dawson's story than met the eye. The next day at school, Jaden noticed something strange. Mr. Dawson was even quieter than usual, almost as if he were trying to disappear into the background. There was a new tension in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. During lunch, Emily came rushing up to him, her face flushed with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said, practically bouncing on her toes. "What is it?" Jaden asked, intrigued. "I overheard the office staff talking," Emily said, lowering her voice. "They said someone from the district is coming to the school today, someone important. And they're here to talk about Mr. Dawson." Jaden's eyes widened. "You think it's about what happened in class?" Emily shrugged. "Maybe, but it sounds bigger than that. Like they're looking into his whole background." The rest of the day felt like a waiting game. Jaden couldn't help but wonder what was going on behind the scenes. He tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting back to Mr. Dawson and the mysterious visitor from the district. When the final bell rang, Jaden walked out into the hallway, only to find a crowd of students gathered near the main office. They were whispering excitedly, their faces filled with curiosity and anticipation. "Did you see him?" one student asked. "Yeah, he looked serious," another replied. Jaden pushed through the crowd, trying to get a better look. Standing just outside the principal's office was a man in a sharp suit, his expression calm but authoritative. Jaden recognized him immediately. It was one of his father's colleagues from the district board. The man glanced in Jaden's direction and gave him a small nod, as if to say, "We've got this." Jaden felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, curiosity, and a lingering sense of unease. Whatever was happening, it was clear that Mr. Dawson's actions had set something much bigger into motion, and Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. The air in the school felt heavier than usual the next day, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Jaden walked into class, his mind buzzing with everything he'd overheard the day before. He glanced toward the front of the room, where Mr. Dawson sat stiffly at his desk. The teacher's usual stern expression was replaced by something else, an uneasy mix of anger and fear. The classroom felt different too. The students, who normally chatted and laughed before the bell, were unusually quiet. It was as if they all sensed that something was brewing, though none of them could put their finger on what. Jaden noticed Emily shoot him a questioning look from across the room, but he just shrugged. Even he wasn't sure what was about to happen. Halfway through the lesson, the classroom door creaked open, and the principal, Mrs. Reynolds, stepped in. She was accompanied by the same sharply dressed man Jaden had seen the day before. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward them, and the tension rose immediately. "Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Reynolds said in a tone that left no room for argument, "we need to speak with you. Now." Mr. Dawson's face went pale, but he nodded and stood up. As he passed by the rows of desks, Jaden could feel the weight of his gaze linger for a moment, but the teacher said nothing. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the room exploded into whispers. "What's happening?" Emily hissed, leaning toward Jaden. "I don't know," Jaden replied honestly, though his pulse quickened. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just a slap in the classroom. The minutes ticked by slowly as the class tried to focus on their assignments, but it was nearly impossible. Everyone was distracted, their ears straining for any hint of what was going on outside. Finally, the door opened again, and Mr. Dawson returned. His face was tight, his shoulders hunched, and there was a faint tremor in his hands as he picked up a stack of papers from his desk. Without a word, he began handing them out to the students, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Jaden. "Complete these worksheets," he said in a clipped tone. "I'll be at my desk." He sat down heavily, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in front of him. The students exchanged puzzled glances, but no one dared to speak. It was clear something had changed, but no one knew what. After class, Jaden and Emily lingered in the hallway, watching as Mr. Dawson disappeared into the teacher's lounge. "I don't get it," Emily said. "If they were going to fire him, wouldn't it have happened by now?" "Maybe they're giving him a chance to explain himself," Jaden suggested, though he wasn't entirely convinced. As the day went on, more rumors began to spread. Some students claimed that Mr. Dawson had a history of disciplinary issues at other schools, while others whispered about a mysterious file being reviewed by the district. By lunchtime, the entire school seemed to be buzzing with speculation. Jaden tried to keep his focus, but it was hard not to let his mind wander. He thought about what his dad had said, that decisions made for convenience often came back to haunt people. Was this one of those situations? Later that afternoon, Jaden was called to the principal's office. His stomach churned as he made his way down the hallway, his footsteps echoing the empty corridor. When he entered, he saw Mrs. Reynolds sitting behind her desk, her expression calm but serious. The sharply dressed man was there too, standing by the window with his arms crossed. "Jaden, please have a seat," Mrs. Reynolds said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Jaden sat down, feeling the weight of their gazes on him. "We've been reviewing the incident involving you and Mr. Dawson," the man said, his voice measured. "Your account of what happened has been consistent, and we appreciate your honesty." Jaden nodded, unsure of what to say. "We also discovered some concerning details about Mr. Dawson's past," the man continued. "It seems that the complaints filed against him at previous schools were more serious than we initially realized. They were dismissed too quickly, and that's a failure on our part." Mrs. Reynolds leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Jaden, we want you to know that we're taking this situation very seriously. Mr. Dawson has been placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation." Jaden's heart raced. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or uneasy. "Does he know yet?" Jaden asked. Mrs. Reynolds nodded. "Yes, he's been informed of the decision and will not be teaching here until the investigation is complete." As Jaden left the office, he felt a mix of emotions, relief that the situation was being addressed, but also a lingering sense of unease. Something about the way Mr. Dawson had been acting still didn't sit right with him. That evening, Jaden's dad sat him down for a talk. "I heard about what happened today," Mr. Carter said. "The district is taking steps to make sure this doesn't happen again." "But what about Mr. Dawson?" Jaden asked. "What happens to him now?" "That depends on the investigation," his dad replied. "If they find enough evidence of misconduct, he could lose his teaching license." Jaden nodded, but he couldn't help feeling a twinge of guilt. Despite everything, he didn't want to see Mr. Dawson's life completely fall apart. The next morning, Jaden walked into school to find the atmosphere even more tense than before. Students whispered in clusters, and teachers seemed unusually on edge. As he made his way to class, he noticed Emily standing by their usual spot, her expression grim. "What's wrong?" Jaden asked. "It's all over the news," Emily said, holding up her phone. Jaden glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. The headline read, "Asterisk Teacher's Troubled Past Exposed Amid School Investigation." Asterisk. As he read the article, his heart sank. It detailed the allegations against Mr. Dawson at his previous schools, including incidents of inappropriate discipline and verbal altercations with students. The story had spread quickly, and now everyone knew. Jaden looked up from the phone, his mind racing. This wasn't just about what had happened in their classroom anymore. This was a full-blown scandal, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. "What do we do now?" Jaden didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the situation was far from over, and the worst might still be yet to come. The weight of the news lingered heavily in the air as Jaden walked into the classroom the next day. There was no sign of Mr. Dawson, of course, but the empty desk at the front of the room seemed to loom over the students like a ghost, a silent reminder of the chaos that had erupted. The substitute teacher, a kind but nervous woman named Miss Green, did her best to keep the class focused. But it was clear that everyone's mind was elsewhere. During lunch, Emily found Jaden sitting outside under the big oak tree where they often went to escape the noise of the cafeteria. She looked troubled, clutching her phone tightly as she approached. "Jaden, there's something you need to see," she said, her voice shaky. "What is it?" he asked, sitting up straighter. Emily hesitated, then handed him her phone. On the screen was a video that had been uploaded just hours earlier. It was grainy, obviously recorded on someone's phone, but the content was clear. It showed Mr. Dawson in a heated argument with another teacher in a school parking lot. The voices were muffled, but the captions had been added by whoever posted the video. "You think you can just dig up my past and get away with it?" Mr. Dawson's voice boomed, his face red with anger. "You don't know who you're messing with." The other teacher, a younger man Jaden recognized as Mr. Lopez, looked startled but stood his ground. "It's not my fault, Dawson. The district is handling this. You brought this on yourself." Before the video cut off, Mr. Dawson leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Jaden's stomach churned as he handed the phone back to Emily. "Where did you find this?" "It's everywhere," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone's sharing it. People are saying Mr. Dawson is trying to intimidate anyone who speaks out against him." Jaden shook his head, his mind racing. But why would he do that? He knows the district is already investigating. Threatening someone will only make things worse for him. "Maybe he's desperate," Emily suggested. "Or maybe there's something bigger going on." Jaden thought back to what his dad had said about Mr. Dawson's hiring. The rush decision, the complaints that were ignored. Everything pointed to something deeper, something that had been buried for years. And now it seemed those secrets were starting to come to light. As the day went on, the tension in the school grew thicker. Students whispered about the video, speculating about what Mr. Dawson might do next. Teachers exchanged worried glances, and even the principal seemed on edge. Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that they were all waiting for something to happen. After school, Jaden decided to do some digging of his own. He pulled out his laptop and started searching for any articles or reports about Mr. Dawson's past. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Old news clippings and blog posts from parents who had complained about Mr. Dawson at his previous schools. The stories were all eerily similar. A teacher with a temper, prone to outbursts, who always seemed to leave just before things got too messy. But there was one article that caught Jaden's attention. It was a short piece about an incident at a school 3 years ago, where a student had accused Mr. Dawson of verbal abuse. The complaint had been dismissed, but not before the student's parents had threatened to sue. The article mentioned that the parents eventually dropped the case after reaching a private agreement with the school district. Jaden's heart raced as he read the article. A private agreement. That didn't sound like justice. It sounded like a cover-up. He was so absorbed in the article that he didn't hear his dad come into the room. "Jaden," Mr. Carter said, startling him. "What are you working on?" Jaden hesitated, then showed him the article. "Did you know about this?" Mr. Carter's expression darkened as he read the screen. "I've heard rumors," he admitted, "but nothing concrete. This is troubling. Why would the district cover for him?" Jaden asked, his frustration evident. They knew he had a history, but they still hired him. "Sometimes organizations make decisions to avoid bad publicity," Mr. Carter explained. "It's not right, but it happens. The question is, how far does this go? And who else knew about it?" Jaden's mind raced as his dad's words sank in. If the district had covered for Mr. Dawson before, who's to say they wouldn't try to do it again? And what about the people who had pushed for his hiring in the first place? It was starting to feel like this wasn't just about one teacher's mistakes. It was about a system that had allowed those mistakes to happen. The next morning, as Jaden walked into school, he noticed a crowd gathered near the main office. Curious, he pushed his way to the front and saw a notice posted on the bulletin board. It was an announcement from the district, stating that Mr. Dawson had officially been placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of the investigation. But that wasn't the part that caught Jaden's attention. At the bottom of the notice, there was a small line of text. "All staff and students are reminded to refrain from discussing ongoing investigations publicly or on social media." Jaden frowned. Why would the district want to silence people? Was it just to protect the integrity of the investigation? Or was there something else they didn't want getting out? As he walked to class, he couldn't shake the feeling that the district was trying to control the narrative. And if that was the case, then there was more to this story than anyone realized. By the end of the day, the tension in the school was palpable. Rumors swirled about why the district was being so secretive, and Jaden couldn't help but wonder what they were trying to hide. One thing was certain: the truth wasn't just about Mr. Dawson anymore. It was about everyone who had enabled him, everyone who had looked the other way. Jaden knew he was getting closer to uncovering the real story. But he also knew that the closer he got, the more dangerous things might become. And as he walked out of school that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The next day, Jaden woke up feeling restless. He couldn't shake the unease from the day before, and the pieces of the puzzle were swirling in his mind, begging to be put together. When he arrived at school, Emily was waiting for him near the lockers, her face pale. "Jaden," she said quickly, pulling him aside. "Something's happening. You're not going to believe this." "What now?" he asked, his stomach knotting. It felt like every day brought a new twist. Emily held up her phone, and Jaden's eyes widened. A new video had surfaced online, but this time it wasn't just about Mr. Dawson. It was footage of a meeting between two district officials, secretly recorded in what appeared to be a small conference room. Their voices were low, but the captions made it clear what they were saying. "We need to handle this quietly," one of them said. "If the full extent of his record comes out, it'll blow back on us. The board will demand to know why he was hired in the first place." The other official nodded, looking grim. "We were trying to save face after the lawsuit at his last school. Firing him then would have made us look incompetent. But now, this is spiraling out of control." The video ended abruptly, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the school. The comments section was already flooded with outrage, and hashtags like #JusticeForStudents and #DistrictScandal were trending. They knew, Jaden whispered, his voice thick with anger. They knew what kind of person he was, and they hired him anyway. Emily nodded. "And now they're scrambling to cover it up. But who recorded this? And why leak it now?" Before Jaden could respond, the school intercom crackled to life. "Attention students and staff," Mrs. Reynolds' voice said, strained but steady. "All students are to report to their homerooms immediately. Teachers, please secure your classrooms. This is not a drill." Jaden and Emily exchanged nervous glances before heading to their homeroom. The atmosphere was tense as the students filed in, their whispers barely contained. Once everyone was seated, Miss Green closed the door and stood at the front of the room, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "I don't know exactly what's going on," she began, "but I need everyone to remain calm. The administration is handling the situation." Jaden's mind raced. Was this about the leaked video? Or was something else happening? He glanced at Emily, who looked just as anxious as he felt. An hour passed with no updates, and the suspense was unbearable. Then suddenly, the intercom buzzed again. "All students are to remain in their classrooms," Mrs. Reynolds said. "Law enforcement is on campus to ensure everyone's safety." Law enforcement? Jaden's heart pounded. What could possibly warrant that kind of response? Moments later, the door to their classroom opened, and two police officers stepped inside. They spoke quietly to Ms. Green, who nodded and motioned for Jaden to step forward. "Me?" Jaden asked, his voice trembling. The officers nodded, and he reluctantly followed them out into the hallway. Emily shot him a worried look, but he couldn't reassure her. He had no idea what was happening. The officers led him to the principal's office, where Mrs. Reynolds and Jaden's father were waiting. Mr. Carter looked worried but calm, and he placed a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder as he entered. "What's going on?" Jaden asked, his voice small. "We need your help," Mrs. Reynolds said, her tone unusually gentle. "The person who leaked the video has come forward, and they've revealed some alarming information about Mr. Dawson. We believe you might have insights that could help us." Jaden frowned, confused. What kind of information? Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded to one of the officers, who handed Jaden a file. He opened it to find a series of documents detailing not only Mr. Dawson's past misconduct, but also evidence that he had been using his position to manipulate and intimidate students and staff. There were notes about a network of enablers, people who had helped him stay under the radar for years. What does this have to do with me? Jaden asked, though he was beginning to piece it together. The person who leaked the video mentioned your name, Mrs. Reynolds explained. They said you might have overheard something important, something about how this all ties back to the district. Jaden's mind flashed back to the conversation he'd overheard between his dad and the district official. I think my dad might know more than he's letting on, he said hesitantly, glancing at Mr. Carter. His dad sighed, looking conflicted. Jaden, I didn't want to involve you in this, but yes, I knew about some of the issues with Mr. Dawson's hiring. I didn't know the full extent, but I suspected something was off. When I tried to push for answers, I was shut down. Why didn't you say anything? Jaden asked, his voice rising. Because I thought I could fix it from the inside, Mr. Carter admitted. I didn't want to risk my position or yours, but now it's clear that staying silent was the wrong choice. Before Jaden could respond, the door opened and Emily walked in looking defiant. If you're asking him for help, you might as well hear what I have to say too, she said. Mrs. Reynolds looked surprised but nodded. Go ahead. Emily took a deep breath. I found something else. The person who leaked the video also posted a series of emails between district officials. One of them mentioned a meeting with Mr. Dawson just days before he was hired here. They knew about his past, but they decided to bring him in anyway because they thought he'd keep quiet about other issues in the district. The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just about Mr. Dawson. It was about a corrupt system that had prioritized self-preservation over the safety of its students. The officers exchanged a look, then turned to Mrs. Reynolds. We'll need to take this information to the district attorney, one of them said. As they left, Jaden and Emily sat down, their minds racing. They had uncovered the truth, but it wasn't the victory they had hoped for. The system was broken, and fixing it would take more than just exposing one bad teacher. But as Jaden looked at his dad, who finally seemed ready to stand up for what was right, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was just the beginning.